Good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to this webinar organised by Resilience First. For those of you who weren't able to view the opening video, Resilience First's mission is to help build resilience across business communities, whether those communities be defined by geography or special interest. In the government's last economic crime plan, reaching out to 2022, and reinforced in the National Crime Agency's annual report covering this year and next, the introductions make it clear that economic crime remains a significant threat to the security and prosperity of the UK. It impacts on all our society, including our citizens, companies, and communities. Fraud is now one of the most common crimes in the UK, with 1 in 15 people falling victim a year. Money laundering enables criminals to profit from some of the most damaging crime, and bribery and corruption undermine fair competition and barriers to economic growth. Terrorism financing facilitates the atrocities we've all suffered here in the UK, as well as across Europe and the rest of the world. So all economic crimes weaken people's faith in the effectiveness of governmental and commercial organisations. This picture has been put in sharp relief by the pandemic. In fact, it's true to say that crime never sleeps, even during a pandemic. The Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime had stated in a policy brief in March that whilst the effects of the pandemic have caused a decrease in some organised criminal activities, it has also provided new opportunities in other areas, such as cybercrime, counterfeiting, money laundering, and fraud. Hence, today we've organised this webinar to shed some light on aspects of economic crime around the pandemic and what it means for businesses and communities. During the next hour, we look forward to hearing from the National Crime Agency on how the agency has been tackling economic crime during the global lockdown, as well as new trends or areas of concern that businesses should be aware of. We will also hear from 2 professionals who will describe their experiences and relay their lessons learnt at the sharp end. We are fortunate to have today in the chair for our webinar Nicola O'Connor, who is Legal Director at Bird & Bird. Nicola in turn will introduce the 3 speakers. So just before I hand over, I'd encourage all the registered participants to ask questions of the speakers throughout the session by posting brief questions in the chat box to the right of your screen. And I'm sure the chair will pick up as many as she can in the Q&A session. And to stimulate discussion, we will poll a single question for you to answer if you wish, the results of which will be discussed by one of our speakers. So enough from me. Thank you to all the speakers and to you listening. And I'll now hand over to Nicola. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm Nicola O'Connor. Yes, I'm Legal Director from Bird & Birds. My background is in white-collar fraud and corporate crime, and I wear various hats at Bird & Bird. So this is a discussion this afternoon that's of particular interest to me. I deal with financial crime compliance, I deal with internal investigations, private prosecutions, and the focus of most of my work is to do with, as I say, fraud, money laundering, and exactly all of the types of issues that we are going to hear about from our speakers this afternoon. As you've heard from Robert, we would really like this afternoon to be truly interactive. There is a chat box on the right-hand side of the screen, and I'd really encourage people to use that. You've seen who our speakers are this afternoon, and I'm going to introduce them in a short while. It may be that you already have in mind some questions that you would very much like to ask, so please don't be shy. Use the chat box, and also let me know if there is a particular speaker that you would like to direct those questions to. You're going to hear a presentation shortly from Graeme Biggar, from the National Crime Agency and the National Economic Crime Centre. It may be that when you're listening to him speak that you think of various questions. So again, if you can put those in the chat box, I can make sure that those are directed at him later. We're then going to hear from Greany, Managing Director of Templar Executives Limited. And you've heard mentioned that there is a poll discussion that is going to happen during that piece. And then followed by Paul Davies, who's Head of Loss Prevention and Security at Selfridges. So you're going to hear from 3 speakers talking about very different areas and their experiences during the pandemic. Now, it's not unusual in a global economic crisis for us to be talking about economic crime and fraud and money laundering. But I think what is particularly interesting about the discussion that we're going to have this afternoon is that we're in really a perfect storm situation. Never before have we had such unprecedented levels of government support by way of loans and grants, combined with people really struggling for survival as individuals and businesses as well. There are so many topics that are going to come up this afternoon, but I just wanted to kick things off by mentioning a few things that have come across my desk during this period. So we've heard quite a lot about the government's job retention scheme and how that might be open to abuse. We know that there has been a hotline where certainly in October last time I looked, over 10,000 people had reported various businesses in relation to fraud relating to the furlough grants. I've been inundated with calls about bounce back loan schemes and how that might be open to abuse. This is a health crisis. And so it's unsurprising that there has been lots of discussion as well about fraud relating to healthcare providers. So scams relating to PPE and masks and hand sanitizers and things of that nature. And then there are ongoing issues that aren't particularly new to the current pandemic, but are situations that you can foresee being a particular problem during this period. So bribery and corruption, it's quite easy to think of scenarios where during a very difficult time, people might be inclined to use bribes to win lucrative contracts. It's quite likely that people might want to avoid payment of tax during periods of time like this. We also have a scenario where lots of people are working from home, and so supervision of staff is very different. And again, that there are lots of issues to do with that. One of the things that I deal with is lots of internal investigations, and there have been some very common themes with businesses concerned about fraud and theft, and others that are particular to this situation. There are also lots of criminal gangs that have been targeting businesses, dealing with various issues to do with online communication particularly. But I don't want to take up too much time. I'm really, really excited to hear from each of the speakers and what they have to say from their point of view. As I say, I'd really be helped if people can put some questions in the chat box as we go along. We're going to hear from Graeme Biggar next. And then after that, we're going to go into the panel discussions and the question and answer section. And it's, as I say, it's really a lot more enjoyable if we've got some feedback and know how you as an audience are feeling and what you're thinking. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Graeme, who'll be able to talk about what's been happening from his perspective and what exactly the National Crime Agency is doing to combat, gosh, there's so many things that he must have to think about during this period of time. So I'm going to hand over to Graeme.
Great, thank you, Nicola. Hopefully I've got the microphone on, always the challenge in these things. So great to be here, great to speak to you all. Thank you, Robert, thank you, Nicola, and everyone involved in setting this up. So I'm Graeme Biggar, as Nicola and Robert both said. I wear two hats, effectively. I'm one of the DGs in the National Crime Agency, so looking at all of serious and organised crime. But then specifically, I'm the Director General for the National Economic Crime Centre. And just briefly to say what that is, it is about 2 years old now, and it was set up to try and effect a step change in the fight against economic crime by better coordinating the various public sector, largely, organisations involved in it. So it's a multi-agency group of people, just under 100, from the NCA, obviously, where we are based and hosted, but also the Serious Fraud Office, the City of London Police, the Financial Conduct Authority, the Crown Prosecution Service, the Home Office, and HMRC. And then we work really closely with parts of the private sector. We'd like to do more of that to try and have the greatest effect. And we work across economic crime, so all the areas that Robert and Nicola have both mentioned. So I want to talk about three things in the 10 minutes I've got here. So fairly briefly, what happened to crime generally during COVID so far. Then secondly, on what happened on economic crime and how we tried to respond to that in general. And then finally, I'll just pick up on specific things that are more relevant to businesses and therefore more relevant to the audience we've got for this webinar. So on the first of those topics, then, what happened to crime generally? So crime generally dropped when COVID kicked off, and that wasn't surprising because everyone was locked down and at home. So there was a lot less retail, there was a lot less of the nighttime economy, and that is what generates a lot of the day-to-day crime. And so crime kind of changed in a different way. So what happened was largely what we predict. It's very long, that spike in prices. The supply, as it always does with drugs, still managed to come in. Organised immigration crime, we were really worried that was going to spike a lot during COVID. The trends we saw were slightly up in the previous year, but not hugely up. We still think that is underreported, and that more of it, and that is what we have seen over recent months. There are more reports coming in of stuff that happened during that period. So that's what broadly happened on crime and organised crime in the round. Our response to that was that we kept going as an organisation, as policing did. We were very much trying to keep going. We still had people absolutely in the office and on the streets. We were forecasting ahead and producing lots of kind of updates for government and others on what was happening. We were reprioritising our efforts into the areas that seemed to be growing. So we were doing a bit less on commodities and absolutely doing more in the online space. We were doing a bit more in what we call the protect space, so trying to help people protect themselves from crime. So things out on cyber awareness, things out on how to keep your children safe when they're doing online schooling and the like. And a lot of that was very effective. And we also took the opportunity, crisis always brings opportunity to work with more partners more often than we had done before. And we particularly did that on economic crime, and I'll come back to that in just a sec. So that was crime as a whole. What happened on economic crime specifically? So fraud actually dropped by 25% in the first couple of months. So reported fraud against individuals and businesses, to be specific. What we saw is what you always see when there is a big event, that COVID was used as a hook and an opportunity for fraudsters, and we definitely saw that growing during the period. But it's important to keep that in context. It was never more than about 2 to 3% of the fraud reports that were coming into action fraud. So very specific COVID frauds. There was, as part of that, Nicola mentioned it, frauds about PPE, about test kits, so fake versions of both of those, hand sanitizers and the like. We set up a particular project to look into that. We seized hundreds of thousands of fake PPE and tens of thousands of fake test kits, self-test kits. So that definitely happened. But there was also quite a lot of change in what was happening on fraud generally. So it wasn't specific COVID fraud, but it was fraud in a time of COVID. So inevitably, there was an awful lot more online shopping happening during the COVID crisis, and you saw online shopping fraud increase pretty much proportional to the overall increase in online shopping. So that's kind of one example. We also saw an increase in investment fraud and romance fraud, so two particularly high harm, high value types of fraud during COVID. Some of it occasionally with a COVID hook. You can invest in a vaccine. I'm a doctor and really need some help, a romantic partner. But a lot of it not. But it just took advantage of that period, and we have seen an increase in those two particular areas. That drop for 25% didn't last very long. We are now back at the previous trend, which is the kind of steady increase in fraud. What was particularly new about fraud during COVID was, of course, and Nicola mentioned this, the government stimulus packages, the massive procurement the NHS had to do. So massive scope there for fraud inevitably. And we've definitely seen lots of attempts to that in all the areas that Nicola mentioned. I'll come back to that a little in a second. Money laundering was interesting during that period. We definitely saw organised crime groups having a cash flow crisis just in the way that normal businesses were. It was harder to move money around and to do that in a covert way during COVID. And it was a problem for them, which we quite enjoyed watching. And it also gave us some good opportunities. And so we seized more cash from criminals during COVID than we were expecting to. That was helped by the way we managed to get inside the EncroChat phone network, which you may have seen in the media, which was a fantastic success that we had working with the French and the Dutch. And really quite extraordinary progress there. What we did in response on money laundering and fraud was we set up a fusion cell that tried to bring in more people working on this, more people sharing information on this than we had done before. So we ended up with a weekly meeting with about 20 organizations on it, about half public sector, but bringing in central government in a way we hadn't done before, and about half private sector. And definitely involving the banks, who are kind of key partners for us, but not just the banks. We had the likes of BT, insurance, and various other organizations on it. Just meeting weekly and trying to share information about what they are seeing, everyone was seeing in their own systems, and what we could do to try and combat it. So that was quite a big step forward that we're trying to maintain into the future. We did more work on Protect. We did more public communication and more coordinated public communication than we had done before on how to protect yourself from fraud. We also did some good work with data, trying to spot what was happening and find ways of stopping it. We worked quite closely with the NHS, and we ran potential suppliers to the NHS through our systems to see if they had a serious and organised crime record in them. And doing that actually managed to stop a number of contracts that we suspect absolutely would have been fraudulent and saved tens of millions of pounds, which was very good. I said I'd finally, just in the remaining 2 minutes, run through a few of the specific frauds and developments we have seen that would be relevant to businesses. So PPE fraud, I've mentioned before. Obviously, businesses need to buy PPE as well. And particularly in the early days, that was high risk because the supply just wasn't there. The kind of global supply chains got into a better place, so that is lower risk now, but there is the new emerging threat will be around vaccine fraud. And we haven't seen much of that yet, but we absolutely expect when vaccines begin to roll out that there will be people offering fake vaccines. And so we're trying to get ahead of that trend now. A second type of fraud that we have seen during COVID has been business email compromise fraud or payment diversion fraud or CEO fraud. It's called various different things, but where people get inside your system, persuade you that you've been sent an email by someone in your finance system or your CEO, and persuade you to transfer money to an account that you wouldn't normally do. Much easier to happen when everyone's working from home and online, and we have seen a growth in that. Cybercrime, I haven't mentioned, very specific cybercrime. Obviously, we saw more phishing attacks and smishing attacks and the like that were particularly focused around kind of COVID hooks, and that definitely did increase. But actually, the number of ransomware attacks on companies has not spiked during COVID. What we have seen is that the organised crime groups have moved to take action more quickly, having got inside a system. Sometimes they would sit there for 6 months to a year to understand the system and work out when the best time to strike was. Now they've moved slightly more quickly to action. So that's been fairly steady, an increase, but some pretty high profile attacks within that borough, and a really important thing for companies to do to make sure that they've got the right systems in place to prevent that. I'd say finally then something in the last kind of 30 seconds or so about money laundering. It still is a struggle for the criminals to work out how to do that in the time of COVID. We have definitely seen more attempts to use cash-rich businesses, high-value dealers to to launder their cash. And as we have tightened up things with the banks in terms of getting kind of money into the financial system, we have also seen MSBs being used, cryptocurrency growing more, post offices as well, where you don't have to register your ID to be able to deposit cash in the way you do with banks, being used to get money into the financial system. So there are definitely areas there where businesses could be vulnerable to being exploited in money laundering. I'll pause there. That was a really quick run through. I think I've just stuck to my 10 minutes, but really hope and look forward to taking questions. Back to you, Nicola.
Thanks so much, Graeme. That was an awful lot of things rattled through in a short space of time. So we're now coming into our panel discussion phase. But at the start, I'd like to introduce our other two speakers who are going to be talking about what's been happening during COVID from their perspective. And the first person that I'd like to introduce is Chris Greany. He's Managing Director of Templar Executives Limited. You'll have seen his biog, and he has an awful lot of experience in relation to cyber security. And I will hand over to Chris now.
Well, thank you very much. And I can assume you can all hear me before I start talking. And half an hour through, you know, we've all fallen asleep. You said I didn't hear a word of it. So a nod from someone or a message to say you can hear me would be very useful.
All good.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I think it's fair to say there is going to be a poll coming up now about fraud. I would welcome everyone who's on the call to respond to it, and we can watch the numbers appear on the polls part of the chat. I think it's fair to say, first of all, thank you to Graeme and the NCA. I'm a great supporter of the NCA. I'm a great supporter of what the Knowings does. And I think the NCA, if we've got any hope of trying to get ahead of this, it's the NCA, our frontiersmen. That doesn't mean it's all good, though, I'm afraid. And we cannot expect the poor old NCA to try and solve the problems of the world with their limited budgets and resources. What they do, I think, is excellent. And I want to get that on the record. I've had a public sector and a private sector career, both in global corporate and global public sector, you could argue, and now running a bespoke consultancy supporting global businesses. But I think, you know, there's a number of things we need to really face up to. If you look at the recent publications by the NAO and HMRC in relation to the billions lost to COVID-19 fraud, they do remind us all that fraud and financial crime is the largest sort of crime type in the UK. And it does need a much better prevention and detection strategy. One of the challenges, I think, around economic crime compared with counterterrorism, and Graeme has a lot of experience in this as well, is the data for CT is generally controlled and owned by the state. The data for economic crime and fraud is generally owned by the private sector. So there's a different way in which you have to approach trying to deal with these things. And, you know, the neck of the NCA is a great step forward, which I also support, but I do think the ecosystem as a whole, and I've said this before, and needs a complete review. It's over 10 years ago since Lord Goldsmith, the Attorney General back then, you know, brought up, you know, the issue of fraud, national force, coordination, and really not much has changed. And if we are really focused on the consumer or the victim, I think one of the challenges in the public sector and policing and law enforcement is there's so many different entities trying, A, to deliver a service, but B, if I'm honest, trying to protect their own business as well, that the customer is lost. Fraud is the biggest crime type in the United Kingdom today. The biggest crime type. The response to fraud for many forces has been completely forgotten. And so from a business perspective, you know, even if you're a private victim of fraud, you don't get a great response. As a business victim of fraud, and I'm sorry to say, you don't get any response. I tried to report, give up a £10 million cross-jurisdictional global fraud once. And we had done most investigation, you know, like Nicola, we had a big investigation team in the bank, very high capability. I couldn't give it to anyone in the UK. And in the end, we sort of gave up. And the worst of it was from the many emails I got from different forces, I felt like going around the market, waving my fraud around, you know, please help me. And it was an email from a detective constable and a force I won't name, which basically said, anyway, we haven't got resources and you can afford it. I don't think affordability of loss ever came into reporting crime and having it dealt with. And I think that is the challenge we face today. And when it comes to economic crime, it absolutely needs to be tackled at state level. And there has to be a coherent strategy with tactical delivery behind it that utilises the full capability and capacity of the public and the private sector, not through what I would argue are ad hoc task forces of very willing volunteers, often comprised of the same faces, but a coherent board enshrined and supported by primary legislation that has the power and autonomy to prevent, detect, respond, and act against fraud and financial crime. And I think there should be a greater emphasis, and I have said this publicly, to a national level ownership of assets. If you go and look for what is the total number of assets being frozen today under siege or forfeiture, there is no one central source of information. And if you think about the amount of asset we've probably frozen across police forces and LE, the NCA, and HMRC and SO, it's probably billions, but the coordinated approach to dealing with that asset, there's no central place. I think the NCA should own that. If I can offer that advice, I think the NCA should grasp this and grip it, because they are the good people to do it. But it can't all be led by the state. You know, I don't believe that the state should deal with all the problems in society. And I think business also have to look at themselves and go, how are we going to prevent this with our own business? How are we going to upskill our people? And often, if you look at the cyber piece, and I might have to challenge Graeme on one thing he said where ransomware had fallen. If you look at the Bitdefender statistics, they say ransomware has risen 7-fold this year. I appreciate Graeme is probably looking at reported crime, and both action fraud does not take much reported crime, if I'm honest, because most people don't report it. Only £11 million worth of COVID fraud has been reported for action fraud, and we know it's billions of pounds. So I'm not sure reporting tells us where we are in terms of the landscape. However, I think businesses also need to look at themselves. And I'll give one example of where I think there is a gap. I was speaking to a CEO of a global corporate only 2 days ago about moving all their staff to working from home. And he said, you know what, Chris, if we had had a program of change to do this, to move about 100,000 staff globally to a working home environment, it would have been a 3-year program and $60 million. We've done it with no preparation, no planning. And the British people and people globally are brilliant at adapting to change. But basically, everyone's just up sticks and moved to working from home. The majority of people are not working in a purpose-built shed at the end of their garden that you see in magazines. They're sat on beds, in creaky chairs, in different bedrooms of the house. And I'm one of those people. And how much training have they had from their organisation on how to work safely, protect their network, ensure their route is secure, make sure they've got secure email and they're not just logging in with one password? How much training have companies given their staff to help the staff protect the company and the company's business and the company's clients when they're working from home? So I do think business also has to help itself. So to sum up in my sort of opening is, great, love the NCA, always a big supporter of state-led entities on a federated basis. But it does need to have a strategy leading it. It does need to be an upstream strategy that prevents rather than detects. And I do think we have to get away from thinking prosecution is the answer to this. I think recovery, civil forfeiture is the answer to it, and that's what lawyers do all the time. And secondly, business does have to try and protect itself as well by spending a little bit of money on its staff to protect its business. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Lots of familiar themes there to me that you've mentioned in your discussion to get us kicked off. I'd like to hand over now, because I'm conscious of time, that we want to give Paul enough time to speak. So our next speaker is going to be Paul Davies, Head of Loss Prevention and Security at Selfridges, who's going to talk about his experiences during this period. Over to you, Paul.
Well, good afternoon. Hopefully you can all hear me too. And if Chris or Graeme would be kind enough to give me a further thumbs up or a nod just to confirm that they could hear me, that would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Nodding.
So good afternoon, and again, thank you, Robert and Resilience First, for the invitation to join the session today and share, I guess, our experiences of managing crime and risk this year in what Nicola described at the start of this webinar as the perfect storm. As a quick introduction, so I head up the essentially 4 teams at Selfridges, which are crime and investigations, loss prevention, security, and business resilience. In this opening statement, I hope to share at a very top level a business's perspective, or at the very least a retailer's perspective, in the challenges that we face in combating crime this year. Those types of crimes, certainly where we've seen increases in the year 2020, digital fraud or online fraud as it's more commonly known, money laundering, counterfeiting, to name just a few. And the challenges that I've chosen to speak about are very much specific to dealing with it in the context of a global pandemic and economic crisis. Firstly, just to set the scene a little bit, as a retailer, this year we closed the doors to our physical stores for the first time in our 111-year history. Trading remains tough. Customer footfall is down in all major cities. Store occupancy has capacity limitations to comply with social distancing, and operating costs remain high in comparison. So commercially, things are tougher now than they've possibly ever been. So with all of that, from a financial crime and risk management perspective, we have this enhanced responsibility this year, alongside our executive leadership, to encourage and inspire everyone to never compromise on protecting our business's integrity, regardless of how tough things may become or for how long the impacts may be felt. We need to stay true to our values and our codes of ethics and continue being a responsible and ethical business. As a risk management function, we've certainly had to be more versatile, more agile in our approach to crime this year, as the focus of our commercial offering has changed from being physical in our stores to digital, back to physical, back to digital. Then how we respond to the way that our business needs to trade and where risks emerge, we've had to be much more reactive and responsive than proactive this year. For example, when our stores were closed, we focused our efforts towards digital fraud or online fraud, towards the risk of carrier or third-party logistics theft, and even customer or international returns fraud. When we reopened the doors to our stores after the first lockdown, we saw a significant increase in cash transactions, which was both unexpected and exceptional to what we prepared for. So our focus then turned immediately back towards the risk of money laundering and counterfeit cash and other crimes at the point of sale. So unlike in previous years where our efforts and our focus was much more steady and strategic, this year we've had to be much more agile and responsive in the way that we work. Secondly, we've never done this before. So there's no blueprint, unfortunately, in how to close down and reopen a business like ours, how to navigate through the uncertainty of a pandemic and an economic crisis, and then how to combat crime and the variations or nuances of some of those crimes, fraud in particular, in that period. We certainly weren't receiving any guidance or intelligence that was sent to us to lead us towards what crimes we could or should expect to see in this period. Our increases in digital fraud, for example, were expected to be proportionate to the increase we saw in digital sales, but without any meaningful intelligence behind that, we had to be responsive and hyper-vigilant to the analysis, more frequent analysis that we were doing, rather than proactive in the controls and rule setting that we could have done if we could have got ahead of that. I guess in a final statement, one of the reasons I was keen to join the session today was to put forward the question to the panel, which might be somewhat rhetorical. I might even end up answering it myself, but it'd be good if Graeme and Chris could offer some thought towards it too. And it's this: how do we as businesses, and not just retailers, how do we become more aware of new trends and threats in UK crime? When I speak to industry experts and other businesses, regardless if they're retail or otherwise, it feels like we all experience similar patterns in crime or methods of crime. But do we do enough to get ahead of it, become more proactive or even predictive in our shared intelligence to help support both one another becoming more resilient, but also to hinder and restrict the criminal organisations that sit behind it? It certainly feels like we could be doing more. Thank you, Nicola.
Thanks so much for that, Paul. We're now into the panel discussion, and perhaps I should hand over actually to Graeme to see if he wants to come back and answer that question that Paul has just been posed about information that might be available to businesses.
Yeah, it's a good question. I see there's lots of questions in the chat as well, so looking forward to all of those. So historically, we have not done this well enough, I think. We are reforming our suspicious activity reporting system at the moment. I mean, people have been saying that for about 10 years, but we genuinely are at the moment and making progress, increasing the size of the FIU, changing the IT. But But a crucial part of it is getting better feedback out to reporters in the regulated sector, but beyond as well, to tell people what is happening. We've recently set up podcasts and webinars from our financial intelligence unit to put some of that information out there. We have gone round and done roadshows with some of the regulated sector. It has been very focused so far on banks, legal profession, accountancy profession, which is the kind of bread and butter for us. But we're happy to go elsewhere. We did one with auctioneers recently. We could do one with the retail industry if that would help. So it's a good challenge. We're doing a bit more. We definitely need to do more still. The onus, just picking up on Chris's point, shouldn't just be on us. I think that needs to be a joint endeavour, obviously, with different parts of the private sector who will tell us what they are seeing in ways that we won't know.
Thank you. And quite a few questions in the chat box for us to get through, but there's certainly a theme. One of the things that people have picked up on is comments that were covered by Chris, really, to do with businesses trying to report fraud and how difficult that can be. I certainly know from my own practice and I echo what Chris has said, really, that it can be incredibly difficult for businesses to report fraud and get any kind of response. That some of the questions talk about action fraud particularly, which I know has been in for an awful lot of criticism as to the fact that there isn't a lot of action that happens once things are reported sometimes, and so really I throw it open to the panel to discuss this a little bit more, as clearly this is something that people who are watching are finding very difficult as well. Chris, did you want to say some more on it? Oh, we can't hear you. No. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think first of all I should say that I ran action fraud for 2 to 3 years. I was overseeing it, so I'm responsible for some of these issues, and I put my hand up to that. Action fraud as an idea, a central reporting service that allows people to report their fraud, is a great idea. It's the only system in the world that exists. I'll say that. The execution of action fraud, the funding of action fraud, delivery of action fraud cannot deal with it. And there's a number of reasons that exists. One is there's no national strategy on fraud. We used to have a national fraud authority that existed, which the former Home Secretary Theresa May disbanded, and action fraud was sort of the byproduct of that. So I also do believe, and I was a former City of London police officer and a Met police officer, I don't think one force anymore can lead forces naturally because they have no legal mechanism in which to do so. And so it's best endeavours, it's cajoling, it's encouraging, it's asking. Unlike the NCA that has a clear legislative tasking authority, which can work, it is a nuclear option, but it can work. I think the world has moved on. And if you want a central reporting service, it has to be funded, it has to have execution and delivery, and it has to provide confidence to both victims and reporters. If you can't deliver that, in my view, don't bother having it, because it lets everyone down otherwise. Now, that is not a criticism of my former force, because I was responsible for it as well. It's an observation based on the reality of how it's been brought into fruition, and the city funds some of it from its own budget, and that shouldn't happen either. One force should not be funding a national service. That seems inequitable to me. However, so that's why I say the ecosystem needs to change, because currently, if we're honest, and I saw Toby's comments in there as well, is that it is almost impossible to report a large fraud, action fraud. Let's be honest about it. You want to roll a £10 million fraud into a national fraud service run by call handlers in Scotland, who are good people, and I listen to calls, they're great people, really kind people, and try and explain an interjurisdictional global fraud affecting 5 companies and 6 shell companies, of which you've done the investigation already and put a red bow on the top. You can't do it. You can't do it. And so that is not a fault of action fraud. That's a fault of the ecosystem, because once action fraud has done its reporting, and that's all it does, is take a report, it then goes to the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, which is another 48 to 60-day cycle. By that time, your fraudster's bought his boat, sold his yacht or her yacht, and moved on. And let's be honest about this. Business knows that. Business knows what about P&L, knows where the money goes. So either you're going to deal, execute quickly, or you're not. And I think we should be honest about it, about what we're going to do, not just the state, the public and the private sector. And I go back to Graeme that the only way we'll tackle this, and I've said this for 8 years, is legislative change that brings the private sector and the public sector together in a formal legal partnership and gives them power to act across boundaries where it can. Because currently we are relying on the good British way of best endeavours. We do really well on the back of that, actually. We're very successful collectively, but I think the ecosystem needs to change. Since I left policing, 4 years ago, there's been 3 successive economic crime reviews. And each one has either been shelved, but pushed into the ether, or if I'm honest, certain establishments, and the NCA is not one of them, because it's the most collaborative establishment going, have tried to fight their own battles about their own existence rather than the good of the customer. And that's got to change.
Graeme, do you want to come in now?
Yeah, no, very happy to. I mean, there's lots of what Chris said that I agree with. I mean, it's worth saying that action fraud gets the brunt of the criticism that should fall to the country as a whole for the way we are trying to do fraud. It is the thing that people see, but it is only one part, as Chris said. So actually, they've been doing pretty well recently. They've had a few minor problems that were quite significant about the way they dealt with certain people that the Times exposed. But actually their call handling figures now are really quite good. They do need to, someone pointed out the thing they've got on their website at the moment in the chat, and that's absolutely right. That needs to change. But I've called them a few times, others have, and I've seen the stats. They are responding really quickly and recording really well, and they have actually done really well during COVID. But it then goes into NFIB. And it needs to be processed there, and the IT system that enables that is insufficient and is being replaced, but that is a real blocker. But even if they process that really well, someone's got to investigate it, and it is 35% of reported crime at the moment, Crime Survey England and Wales, and less than 1% of policing. And so we just have a massive capacity challenge with addressing it. So the response to that is partly national fraud strategy, as Chris has mentioned. And it's basically 5 things, and I've sent them out to the Home Affairs Select Committee and others. But it is a single governance and leadership of this, in line with what Chris was saying, not exactly the same way, but broadly, you've got to bring people together to do this, and it's got to be clear it's too disparate. It's a more intelligence-led approach. Secondly, we have been too based on trying to follow and investigate individual cases when we'll never have the capacity to do all of that. So you need to understand what's happening out of all of those to try and go for the big hitters, basically. And then you do that in 2 ways. You use that intelligence to drive your protect approach. How can you design out fraud in banks, in businesses, and by communicating to the public with individuals? And then you target the pursue resources, the investigative resources you have at the groups that you can see are driving the biggest harm, rather than trying to investigate every single report, because you just can't do that. And then you wrap around that, the 5th and final point, a better victim support, particularly for individuals, not least because the damage is still greater to those individuals, or it really can be, than to businesses. It is very often existential for individuals, but also because the stats show that there is a surprising degree of repeat offending against victims. So being defrauded once, you are quite likely to be defrauded again. So we need to improve that. Those are the 5 broad things that we need to do, I think, to make it better. It needs some reform, it needs some investment, and it will need some legal change too.
Thank you. Oops. Yes. So there were some earlier questions that I don't want to miss, actually, as we've gone along. So some of the earlier questions, I think, really relate to Graeme's discussion. We're being asked, what exactly do you mean by vaccine fraud? And quite unrelated, but there are 2 questions for you, I think, Graeme, really. Which is about what role banks can play in strengthening anti-fraud capabilities. So perhaps the vaccine question first, and others might want to speak about banks' involvement.
Yeah, so vaccine fraud, very simple. Someone, pretending to sell a vaccine when it's not actually a vaccine at all. And we saw that. We arrested, well, actually it was City who did the arrest in Sussex right at the start of this, someone who was selling test kits, not vaccines, and treatment kits around the world, which were basically poisonous. So you will see that happen again, people pretending to sell or selling fake vaccines, and people will be keen to get them urgently. They won't be top of the waiting list, so they might go for it. So that's what it is. We need to be trying to get ahead of the game on that, spot it, warn people about it, and stamp right on it when it happens. What can banks do more of? I mean, to be fair, they have done a lot recently, which is really positive. So confirmation of payee was introduced in the summer by most banks. So when you try and transfer money to someone, it does actually check that the name on the bank account receiving the money is the one that you think it is, and gets you just to confirm if it doesn't look like it's absolutely right. That's a really important way of trying to cut down on authorized push payment fraud, which is hundreds of millions a year. We're working on something with the banking industry at the moment, which we need to find a new name of, but we're calling configurable bank accounts, which is to give customers the ability to just change the settings to effectively put a little bit more friction, but thus safety, into the way they are managing their money, rather than having everything instantaneous. So that kind of builds on confirmation of payee. Their IT systems and data management has improved over recent years, different progresses for different banks, and therefore their ability to spot things that could well be fraud and stop them and freeze them in action, rather than just when the customer reports it, has improved. Some of the banks are getting quite good at that. That needs to happen across the banks. So in each bank, and then also if they started to share data, it could be with each other and with us, it could be much more effective than it is at the moment. And finally, we're quite keen to really do that on a big scale, and this will get into money laundering as well, is look at real-time transactions and spot what the patterns are that are clearly the laundering of money and the very quick movement of money from one account to the other, and be able to freeze it. There's a whole bunch more, but I better stop there and allow some other questions.
Mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
There are two themes really in some of the other questions. One is to do with resources to be able to fight the extent of the criminal activity that each of the speakers has been talking about this afternoon. And the other is whether or not punishments are sufficient to try and deter criminal gangs or people who might be tempted to commit fraudulent economic crime activities, whether or not we think that that the legislation in place at the moment is sufficient to deal with the problems. Do each of you have any comments about those issues?
I don't want to entirely hog it, but I'll go first if there's nothing from anyone else. So punishments, not necessarily. I read the report of a trial in Glasgow recently where the convicted criminal was saying, but it was only a white collar crime, which is not the right way of thinking about these things. But I don't think it's the most important and pressing issue to us, because we are getting so few people to trial that I don't think it's the length of time, the lack of a length of time of sentence that is not deterring people. It's the fact that they're not being caught and prosecuted at all. Yeah. So there's an awful lot of things we need to do before addressing sentences. Could we change the legislation? Yes, we could in various ways. We want to look at POCA again. I think I'd want to look at corporate criminal liability and failure to prevent for fraud, which is a kind of ongoing issue. And the Law Commission looking into that now, but I would look to change that. I think it would be quite good to think about whether we could borrow some of the CT world's approach, and that's, as Chris mentioned, where I've come from most recently, which are crimes in preparation for kind of CT attacks, setting up fake websites and fake companies that are clearly not doing what they are purporting to do, and fake accounts which are clearly going to be receiving fraud. There are things you could do there that would be quite helpful. So there are a range of things, but it's not the only thing. We've got to sort out an intelligence-led approach, more protect, and a bit more capacity to investigate.
You're on mute.
Still on mute.
Oh dear. Can you hear me now? Sorry, yes, you raised corporate criminal offences. It may be that Chris wants to come in on that as well, and the lack of prosecutions that there have been in relation to the Criminal Finance Act and failing to prevent the facilitation of tax evasion. But Chris, were there some other points that you wanted to make in relation to the general legislation comments that have been made in the chat?
I was just going to come back to Graeme, and respectfully, I think sometimes, and I was guilty of this when I was in the public sector, there is some naivety from the public sector on how a bank operates. I think that does exist. Banks are huge global organizations that actually spend billions on technology to prevent, detect fraud. If you look at the spend of a global bank on the technology to identify, prevent, detect fraud, it is a shuddering amount of money. Banks are just the transaction process, and I agree with Graeme to a point that, is there more that can be done? But sometimes I think within the NCA, you've got the wrong people from the bank around the table. You think you've got the right people because you don't know who the other people are you should really have. So you might have someone from fraud risk, you might have someone from cybersecurity, you might have someone from compliance or controls or tech or ethics. There's so many CEOs and COOs in one bank. I never understood till I went to Barclays. And actually, I realized when I went to the bank, we've had the wrong people around the table all the time. So that's one of the issues, I think, about understanding how a bank operates. And they do spend billions on, if you look at most banking apps, they're incredibly well built, well tested, developed, utilized, and safe. And you can see from a banking perspective, if your customer has malware on their own device, it's that advanced and that secure. So then trying to bring in legislation. And first of all, the other thing I'll say, banks in the UK are probably the heaviest regulated industry in the UK today, either having to hold back 12 to 50% of capital they can't use for fines, having to be controlled, supervised, all this, and they have our money, I get that. If you look at, and then trying to bring in a crime of not being responsible, I think that's quite a sledgehammer thing to do against a heavily regulated industry already, personally. If you look at other sectors who also have a hand in fraud, telcos, where are they? They're not regulated at all. There's no regulatory instrument really that holds to account. Companies House, Graeme talked about fake companies. Companies House is an agency of the government and chooses not to do proper diligence whether the company's being set up abroad or not. I think looking closer to home, I know you can have a restricted register, I get that, but Companies House have not performed very well in the past about dodgy companies being set up and having a proper intel feed off the back of it. You might disagree with me, but I do think there are issues closer to home to look at first rather than sort of keep blaming the banks for all the problems of economic crime, because in the end, the banks will say that how much of our money do you want before we stop rating as a bank? I think there is that sort of gentle push. And then, of course, you need the bank support and help to fight it as well. So I think there's a real hard balance here. That's the first thing. And I don't dominate here. Second thing, prosecutions. I'm with Graeme on this. I absolutely agree with Graeme. However, I've always said the civil route in trying to take money off criminals is the most appropriate route. But there is a tension between the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice on doing it. One wants people in prison, one doesn't. And so once again, looking close to home, there's a tension in government about how this operates. I know that from a fact, we tried to do it in the city with KPMG, and there's a big backlash. So once again, big support of the NCA. I keep saying this, and I'm a big supporter of Graeme, but I do think sometimes the public sector is a bit naive on how business operates in terms of that global financial sector, and just hard regulation isn't always the answer.
Thank you. Perhaps I can just direct one particular question to Paul, because we're drawing to a close here. There are probably lots more questions that we could ask, but one of the question picks up on the point that you made, Paul, really, and says that we've spoken for many years about public-private crime prevention partnerships. Do you think there remains a lack of confidence in private industry by public sector agencies? And it's talking about really sort of sharing of fraud data and how things feel. So perhaps you'd like to kick off, Paul, as to what you think about on that subject.
Sure. I don't know if I agree there's a lack of confidence, to kind of share that information with private businesses. I think there's probably a lack of appreciation for the value that can bring. So it's about targeting all resources towards one common goal, right? Public and private. Even if there was a lack of confidence, I'm not sure why there would be, it's about what we want to see. Speaking on behalf, I think, of most of the private businesses, I'm sure they're listening into this. Statistical analysis and an understanding of the method and the trends of crime is possibly what we would want to see. And the more frequent and the more accurate that data that could be shared with us, the more intelligence that could be shared with us, the more we are, as I said just now, targeting all of that public and private resources towards one common mission, one common goal. So I think it's more a lack of appreciation for the value than a lack of confidence.
Thank you. Anything that either of you want to come in on that? We're in our last 5 minutes. Otherwise, I think we'll sum up.
So, Graeme, yeah, I mean, we are keen to do more of that. I'd slightly repeat my earlier points. Don't overestimate the intelligence that we've got that's going to be relevant to your particular sector compared with the intelligence you've got in your company and with the other people in the sector. So we need to bring both of those things together, I think, and we can do more if we do it well. I did want to pick up on one of the other questions, if I could, cheekily, that's there, which was about fraud against the public sector and the COVID schemes and all of that. And I think it was Darren, I can't now see it, but it said, I mean, were the government blind to the risk? Why didn't they think it would happen? And you know, I'm not here representing the government, although I formally am still a civil servant, but I'm arm's length body and able to kind of speak my mind. And they absolutely did. In fact, the government had published, I think internally, but it's probably available publicly as well, by coincidence in February, here are what happens to frauds in major crises, which is off the back of the Australia fires episode that they had done it. It was in their mind. They do know what the challenges are. They had some very tricky decisions to make about the speed of getting money out versus the fraud risk, and that was the balance they took. And they consciously accepted that some of the risk would be on the fraud to get the money out the door quickly to people who needed it, which is a perfectly legitimate political decision to have made. Now, I would have been in the room when I was in the room, or kind of lobbying from outside, saying, oh, "Remember that fraud risk." But it was a legitimate decision to make, and it was an informed decision. And we're working hard now with them to try and get some of those measures back in place now. Things are not quite so urgent, and tighten things up. But of course, there is a lot of fraud happening there, as we had thought there would be.
Thank you. Oh, I think Chris might have a final point to make just before we close.
We've still got 3 minutes, and I agree with Graeme. Fraud risk is just a proportion of risk appetite, and everyone has to make it. And in a crisis like that, what else would you have done? I think, you know, we can all moan about it now, but the fact is, lots of people have survived because of that decision by government. I'm no supporter on either side, but I understand fraud risk. The second thing, data sharing. We've been struggling, public and private sector, with data sharing for years, and it comes to this usually. Public sector want the data of the private sector, but the public sector feel reluctant to give the data back. And that's where legislative changes need to happen. And the other thing I say to all people on both sides of the fence is when you say, we need your data, tell me what data you need, because most companies run on data. And I used to get this in the bank, we need your data, Chris. I said, what data do you want? What data? I've got 3 million customer records. Do you want that? Or do you want our data lake in Chicago? I can't move that because the law in this country doesn't allow it. And if I do give it to you, can you process it? And so I think, you know, the binary question of gives you data is a good one, but be very precise on what you want. And as you know, Nicola, the next thing that leans on his shoulder is group counsel saying, lawfully, we can't share this. And that's why I've said the law needs to change on this. I think every private sector, as long as it had law to support it, would share it quite willingly. But I think it's a bigger thing than just gives you data. I think it goes both ways.
Thank you. So I think we're drawing to a close. We've covered such a lot of information. We've heard from Graeme about what it is that the National Crime Agency is doing to combat such a wide variety of fraud, and we've heard from business as to what their experiences are, and they've all been pretty varied. We could fill another hour, I'm sure, but I'm going to hand back to Robert to close.
Well, this has been a fascinating hour. We've covered, as you say, an immense amount of ground, and we could extend it. But it leaves me just to say, on behalf of Resilience First and all the participants, I would like to thank the speakers and the chair for their superb contributions. So there's been a fascinating interplay. We will be circulating a short summary in due course, as well as share the slides that we have. Finally, please do join our next webinar on the 27th of November, which is on airport innovation. We're pleased to partner with Intel for that. Also, I will just close on time by saying thank you very much for participating in all the questions that come in. Have a lovely evening. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Graeme. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.